So thank you very much for a kind introduction, and I'm really, it's a great pleasure to be here. I also want to thank Professor Zhou and Professor Hollis for really inviting me. And finally, I'm here. Very excited about this. So originally, I think Professor Hollis wants me to talk about my new book, which is The Red Guard Generation and Political Activism in China. The book mainly talks about, basically the protest activities of China's 60s generation. So that's like 50 years ago, and I worry that if I just talk about that, it might be too boring for you guys. So I thought about it, and I thought, well, maybe I can try to combine my interest in the study of internet activism with my interest in the study of Cultural Revolution and Red Guard violence. So it's a little bit of a combination of history, social movements in the past, and activism and youth and the social media in recent years. And so it could come across as a little bit weird combination, I hope, but I hope it has some interest for you guys. Okay. So I wanted to start with a question that has often been asked in the study of media and communication in the popular press, in the past few years after the Arab Spring. There has been a debate about how important is Facebook, how important is Twitter for political activism, for social activism. Was the Arab Spring a Twitter revolution, or was it a Facebook revolution? So there are a lot of debates, and some analysts really question the power of social media. Does it really matter that if you participate online? How about in the 60s when people really, the protests were widespread, but people took to the street. That was the real protest, and sometimes people risk their own lives. So high-risk activism versus keyboard activism. What is a more meaningful political commitment? So I thought this is a question of general interest for media scholars, for sociologists, for the popular media, and has been debated quite a lot. New Yorker, I think a few years ago, has really an influential article about this question. So I thought I might use the cases that I study, the Red Guard movement and contemporary cyber nationalism, to try to shed some light on this question, to try to understand what is meaningful political activism. This is, of course, also a question that's close to home, in the sense that, in my classroom, whether it's in graduate seminars or in undergraduate classes, this question often comes up. What does it mean to be politically engaged for us as citizens, right? In today's world, does it matter if we just participate by tweeting a few things? How does that differ from taking part in a rally, in Center City, right, in front of the art museum? So this is a question of general interest, and I will try to use the two cases from China to try to think about what really political commitment means. So I'll start with cyber nationalism in China. And again, this has aroused tremendous interest in China, but also provoked a lot of debate and discussion in the international media. So this article is from The Economist. It was last year, August 13th, 2016. So this is an article about a case of cyber nationalistic protest in China that took place in January 2016. And the title is the most interesting. The East is red. The East is red, some of you may know, this may sound familiar to, is an iconic song from China, from Mao's China Cultural Revolution. The East is red, red sun, Mao as the kind of the symbol of, of the sun. So the East is red is that classic line. The Economist article is memorable in in sense, it's a slight twist. It's pink. It's not red. It's pink, and this is to describe this younger, newer generation of young people in China, who are patriotic, who are nationalistic, and who in this article and in other articles, there are actually a lot of media coverage of this event. And then there are also quite a few academic studies. Scholars are beginning to study this phenomenon, both in China and here. I actually wrote an article in Chinese for a Chinese journal last year, which was a special issue on this little pink phenomenon. So the East is pink is interesting. What does this mean? It's referring to the protest, January 20th, 2016, when young people in China mobilized online, online meaning in social media, in their gaming communities. They mobilized and then organized a campaign, which they call an expedition, to the Facebook page of the newly elected president in Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen. The newly elected president Tsai Ing-wen has a Facebook page. So the cyber nationalists in China, young people, organized the expedition to attack and challenge the Facebook page of the newly elected president in Taiwan, because the newly elected president has a tendency, as at least perceived by a lot of the mainland Chinese, pro-independence. She has a pro-independence tendency, independent Taiwan, right? So they organized this campaign, this expedition to attack and challenge. And what they did was to leave comments and emojis, right? All kinds of funny. Most of them are very funny, humorous. Some of them very silly kind of emojis on the not only on the Facebook page of the president Tsai Ing-wen, but also on several mainstream media in Taiwan, as a way of challenging their pro-independence position and basically making the argument that Taiwan is part of mainland China. Part of China, you should not declare it independent. So this is a cyber nationalist case of protest. It made a lot of headlines in China, outside of China, and has now been is considered as the most recent important case of cyber nationalism. So I know some of you are in Chinese classes. In Chinese, this group of people has been given a nickname, and the nickname in Chinese is Xiao Fen Hong, right? And in English, it's been translated into Little Pink. Little Pink, partly because one of the websites where they mobilized this expedition is a community of online literature. Can you imagine? Internet literature online community. Some of these communities are huge. The background color of that website is pink. So they thought this is naturally it's a little pink. Another kind of allusion using pink is, at least according to the what we know from the media story, media coverage, and certainly we know that online community, that online literature community, consists a lot of young women, young college students, high school students. In other words, some people believe that a lot of young women are involved in this kind of activities. So Little Pink is the nickname given to this case of cybernationalism. This is one page. This is just one little screenshot from China's Weibo. How many of you know this Weibo? Well, many of you, great. So Weibo is often compared to Twitter, but actually it's quite different from Twitter, the way it's used. But it's a kind of microblogging platform. This is one of the hashtags used during that campaign. And this hashtag translated into English is "I deeply love this country." So there's the red is the original hashtag. So we're all familiar with the kind of hashtag activism here, right? On Twitter, it's like on a daily basis, you see numerous hashtags, and some of the hashtags become so popular that they become viral. They become sort of collective action, right? Unorganized collective action. So this is one example from that case of Little Pink expedition to the Facebook page of Tsai Ing-wen. So as I said, this has attracted a lot of attention. People try to make sense of this phenomenon. What does it really mean? What are these young people doing? What are they trying to do, right? Is it a threat? Does it mean that China is getting really aggressive? These aggressive young nationalists, on an expedition attacking the Facebook page of Taiwanese president. So all these vocabularies, these terms have been used to describe these little pink cybernationalists. So they've been called online mobs. They've been called trolls, and we know trolls are very active here on Twitter as well. They've been compared to cyber red guards, and they are often considered as being manipulated by government because their position seems to be consistent with the government position. So these are some of the kind of ways, at least some commentators see this phenomena. And I'm going to make a different argument. And I will also later on compare the Little Pink phenomena with the Red Guard activism in the 60s. So my argument is that in order to understand the Little Pink phenomena, we got to take pink seriously, meaning we got to contrast pink to red. Pink is similar to red, but it's different from red, right? So they have very different connotations. This is one screenshot from that literature website, online internet literature website called 晋江文学城, for those of you who know Chinese. And the story, in order to understand this phenomena, we need to go back to look at the broader picture of social change, generational change. And since a lot of the participants in this campaign are of the younger generation, so they are considered as the post-90s or the millennials. Who are these millennials? Which has, this generation, this cohort has sometimes been called the me generation, right? China's me generation. And that's a very interesting, it may not, for us, a me generation is something we are familiar with. But actually, if we keep this in mind, and then later when we compare this with the Red Guard generation, it's quite the opposite of the Red Guard generation. I might just say it up front, the Red Guard generation, in the Red Guard movement, one of their targets, one of their slogans was down with the self. Me, being selfish, individualism was one of the major targets of their attack in the 60s, right? So now it's the me generation, me is the center, right? So that's how you can see how different the current younger generation is from the 60s generation. So this generation, post-90s millennials, they were born at a time when Chinese economy was taking off, that unlike earlier generations, they have no personal experience of material hardship. The Red Guard generation, actually the story of the Red Guard generation was longer story, not just the 60s, but all the way through the 70s and 80s. They have a lifelong story of hardship. Actually, that's what my book is about. The first part of my book about the Red Guard generation was about their activism and radicalism and violence in the 60s. But the second part of the book was about their career or experiences after the Red Guard movement. And some of you may know that after the Red Guard movement, they were sent down to the countryside to become peasants and farmers. And most of them typically stay there for a decade in poor villages, mountainous areas, the poorest parts of China, learning to be farmers. So they experience hardships in a way that the younger generation can hardly imagine. It's a very different kind of experience. And unlike earlier generations, the younger generation have certainly seen the world beyond China. Now, not just traveling, tourism outside of China, but studying abroad is quite common. It's totally unimaginable in the 60s, all the way throughout the 80s. Chinese students, more and more students began to be able to travel, to afford to travel, study abroad after the 1990s, really. Although in the 80s, there were a small number of them who were beginning to emigrate, and but that's a very small minority. But at the same time, they've also been receiving very strong patriotic education. Again, it is a typical part of the curriculum. So those are some of the experiences of this younger generation. But they also have been, as I mentioned they've been dubbed as China's me generation, me meaning selfish, right? I'm only interested in my own life, in myself. They are stigmatized as, just being consumers, narcissistic consumers, not very interested in politics at all. And there's a great deal of social pressure just to, prove yourself, right? So this is creates a lot of identity anxieties among this generation. What is the meaning of my life, right? Why do people think that I'm so selfish and always self-centered? That kind of pressure, there's a lot of that because there are media stories, there are on social media as well. There's a lot of talk about this younger generation not interested in politics. That's the me generation. So my argument, that's the broader context. And that broader context is helpful in understanding cybernationalism in the sense that cybernationalism is an opportunity for many of these young people to prove themselves that they are not apolitical, that they are interested in politics. This is only one of many cases. Other cases that people typically, we now remember, some of you may remember 2008, major earthquake in Sichuan province, 2008. Very, very serious disastrous earthquake. After the earthquake, actually the younger generation mobilized. A lot of them volunteered to go to Sichuan, where the earthquake area, to be involved in disaster relief work, again, to prove themselves. And then they won a lot of media coverage and praise, and great. So that's one example. Cybernationalism as another kind of opportunity to prove themselves that they are interested in politics, they are patriotic, that they are not just selfish individuals. There is another reason, there are other reasons why cybernationalism is a particularly interesting way of self-proof. Why cybernationalism and not some other method of self-proof? Another reason is there's political legitimacy. It's fine to be a nationalist, to be a patriot in China, as in everywhere, basically, right? That's politically legitimate. You are not attacking the government leaders. You are not challenging the government. You are not being subversive. So there is political legitimacy. Another reason is the idea of imagined community, which if you are studying international relations, politics, you might be familiar with this concept. Benedict Anderson's concept of imagined community. Now, what is nationalism? So this is one theory, is nationalism is an imagined community. What does that mean? His example, Benedict Anderson's classic study of nationalism was, because of print capitalism, when newspapers became available, when news became available, people in different parts of the country, in different cities, in different states, in the morning, breakfast time was also newspaper time. Everybody would be reading the same newspaper stories. And when television became available, a lot of people would be watching prime news together, same prime news across different parts of the country. That's a way of creating a kind of common national identity, because you are different people. You don't know people in other places, but actually you're reading the same news about the nation at the same time. And in coffee shops, you might be talking about the same national affairs. That creates a sense of national identity across a vast expanse of territories. That is imagined community. An imagined community or nationalism is also a basis of personal pride. So here is the idea, it's a very sociological idea. Our sense of self, how do we develop a sense of self or self-identity? It's always a part of a social process. We develop our self-identity in relation to others. So we are part of a national community. We're part of a neighborhood community. We're part of a family. So that's part of our identity. So national identity, individual identity, in a way, they are sort of symbiotic, certainly very closely related. So national pride is self-pride. Self-pride, national pride is deeply linked together. Interesting examples in this case of little pink nationalism. For instance, as I said, one of the things they did was to post comments or images on the websites in Taiwan. What kind of images did they post? All kinds of funny things. They would post images of cuisine and beautiful scenic spots in China, and just to show, wow, this, see, mainland China, this is very beautiful. There's a lot of great food. That's a sense of pride. There is a very especially interesting viral image about tea-boiled eggs. But the story is a bit complicated, so I'm not going to explain that since I want to move on. If we have time, I can come back to explain that story to you. So that's several, the general social conditions, social change, generational change, identity anxieties of the generation. So I said that self-pride, national pride, they are related. But this kind of national pride or self-pride is not always something you can take for granted. Everywhere is the same. Our sense of pride may be thwarted one way or another under different circumstances, may be challenged, may be undermined, weakened, sometimes fulfilled, achieved. We achieve the sense of pride, and then you feel very proud. But sometimes it's not, it's thwarted. So we see, here are just two images. Again, it's economist. There is a lot of images in the mainstream media, English language media, about China as a threat, right? The rise of China, the discourse about the rise of China and how that kind of China's economic rise. China has become more powerful, economically so powerful, militarily also becoming powerful. That's a threat, right? So this kind of discourse works in a way that really makes a lot of the young people in China resentful about this kind of discourse, right? It's you know, their sense of pride, you know, in a way, it's common for everybody to have a sense of pride about their own nation, but now people find constantly that, you know, there's a very negative image about China, and this kind of discourse about threat and dangers is quite common. So that's another factor in understanding cyber nationalism. The most important factor, though, which I would emphasize, and I did in my article, is how this is deeply tied to their own online culture. So young people grow up, they are the digital natives, right? They live this kind of culture. It's their natural habitat, you know, internet, online culture. So online culture provides the kind of scripts and language for their campaign, for their patriotic, nationalistic campaign. And this is the most, I think, the most important factor to take into consideration in understanding why there is this case of cyber nationalism is taking this particular form. What kind of online culture? So in my book, Professor Hollis mentioned, The Power of the Internet, I have a chapter on the internet culture. Is a culture of humor, culture of play, culture of parody, satire. You know, we hear a lot about Chinese internet censorship, right? Again, from our media here. But Chinese internet is actually quite dynamic. Internet culture is very dynamic in the sense that, you know, despite censorship, sometimes because of censorship, in reaction to censorship, China's internet users, which are often known as netizens is not a very commonly used concept here in English, but in Chinese is a very commonly used concept. They actually they developed this culture to make fun of censorship regime, censorship practices. So that's a whole culture of fun and humor. But it's also a culture of militancy in the sense that online gaming is a key part of Chinese internet culture. So a lot of you probably have heard of this China's major internet firms like Tencent or Sohu or NetEase, right? Some of these. So you know how they make money. You know, they have websites, they have all kinds of services. There are microblog platforms, but what really is profitable for them is gaming. Their main revenues come from gaming. That's because gaming communities are huge. And gaming culture is also a kind of a culture of fantasy, of adventure. If you are gamers, if you play some game, you know, you know, right? It's about war, right? It's about heroism in the war. It's about being a hero, a warrior, and it's almost like martial arts stories, martial art movies of fiction. There is that sense of adventure, you know, being a hero, you know, fighting evil on behalf of the poor, and so on. So that kind of culture is very common culture in online gaming communities, and gamers. You know, this culture is a very important part of that online culture. And it is this culture that actually directly influences the mobilization of this Little Pink campaign. And some of their very concrete tactics are borrowed from their own gaming culture. There's online culture of fandom as well. One thing that happens in fandom communities, online fandom communities, which I suppose is similar in other fandom communities as well, because you know we have there are all kinds of idols, right? And then I have my own idol, you have your own idol. My friends have we have our own idols, and you have your own idols, and we all believe our own idol are the best idol, right? So there's constant kind of virtual warfare among different fans, different fans of different idols, and they will be engaged in all kinds of virtual wars with each other in online communities, challenging the other side, so on. That online, very militant kind of culture of war is again translated or transplanted almost directly into this case of cyber-nationalism. Except that in this case, it's the nation that has become the idol, right? You're fighting on behalf of the nation. They also appropriate, in this campaign expedition, they also appropriate official discourse. There's kind of propaganda, patriotic education, and then they learn all kinds of language that after a while become cliches. But then they will appropriate this language and then use this language also as part of their weapons in their online campaign. So here are just some examples. So they have unique repertoire of what they call emoji packs, funny pictures. I don't have the English translations of these terms. This is kind of appropriation of a kind of official discourse. This one is like, it's quite an insult. It basically says, the middle one, sorry, frankly speaking, your population, and this is referring to population in Taiwan, your entire population is not as many as our emoji packs. So we have more emoji packs than your population. We are so powerful. You are not powerful enough. So this kind of pretty, some of them, as I said, silly. Others are humorous. This is the most visible, important aspect of this expedition. They also pretend to be very heroic, pretend to be heroes. So this is one of the most viral images they used. This is, anybody recognize this image? From, I think it's Hollywood movie, right? Film. So this is kind of there's a language of humor, and then there is a language of imagined heroism, right? This is imagined heroism. On the other side, that little figure actually is borrowed from a best-selling book in the U.S. I forgot the author, but in Chinese translation is Expedition on behalf of myself. Again, it's a heroic figure. And then there is, I mentioned this earlier, the proud display of mainland culture, of the scenery, of the food, and so on. So that's about that case, and I want to say a few things about what's the meaning of that case. People read different interpretations into this case of cyber-nationalism. But the question I wanted to ask here is, as a virtual political expression and engagement, what does it mean? What does this kind of engagement mean? I think, of course, you can take different perspectives. From the perspective of those who are involved in that case, I think a lot of them, for many of them, it was an assertion of their national identity, which at the same time is also an assertion of their self-identity. There could be many other different interpretations, aggressiveness, threat, and so on. But for many of them, it's an occasion for expressing their own self-identity as well as national identity. So now I move on to the, 50 years back to 1966, my Red God book. This is the cover of the Red God book. It was published last year. So if we think about if we consider the cyber nationalism, the little pink cyber nationalism, which I've just talked about, and compare it with Red Guard radicalism, I'm not sure whether this is appropriate analogy, but maybe for the sake of just thinking about the question, we can think about, let's say, hashtag activism today on Twitter, and compare that with the student radicalism here in the US in the 60s, right? So here we're trying to make that comparison. Is cyber nationalism, is little pink cyber nationalism more or less meaningful than Red Guard radicalism? Like the little pink cyber nationalists, Red Guards have been called mobs, irrational, manipulated by government, right? Similar. They were actually both young people. The 60s Red Guards, they were the young generation of that time. They were the millennial of that time, in a way. And today, they're same age level. So they have been, as I mentioned early on, cyber nationalists today have been compared to Red Guards in the 60s. And Red Guards have this have been often considered as irrational, manipulated, and so on. But I'm going to suggest there are some interesting similarities across these two generations, across 50 years, in very different historical circumstances, very different practices. And then we can try to think about the meaning of these two kinds of political commitment. So for the 60s generation, the Red Guard generation, they also grew up in the culture of militancy, adventure, and imagined heroism. So here is a quote from a person who was directly involved in actually war fighting. That was real street fighting, which led to killing and death and violence. And this person, this is what he said. So why was such factional warfare at that time? So the Red Guards were split into different factions and fought against each other, initially verbally, later on physically, and eventually in some places with real weapons. So here is what he said. The cause of factional warfare could be traced to the war education before the Cultural Revolution. When we were kids, we dreamed of fighting wars because wars produced the heroes we worship. The favorite films of young boys were all war films. Growing up in this atmosphere, many of us felt unfortunate to be born after the wars. And therefore, they felt when the Cultural Revolution started in 1966, that was their opportunity to make a revolution. And a lot of them threw themselves into that political process wholeheartedly, sometimes at the cost of their own lives. There are a lot of death. So that's one thing. So, as I said, in the title, I had posters in the title, right? And that's it's important to understand that initially, as I mentioned, they were fighting against each other verbally. And using war posters was probably the most powerful weapon of the time. They would write polemics, revolutionary polemics, using calligraphy, have to be big enough, right, so that people can read from the distance. So these posters are called big character posters, and all over the city, almost around China, especially if you go to university campuses, all the walls would be, all filled with this kind of posters. They were fighting a poster war. Of course, now people are fighting virtual wars in online communities, right? Emojis. But there are some interesting similarities. All this, and then they edited and printed their own newspapers and pamphlets and newsletters. They have a whole print media revolution. Here, this is a photo I took in a library. Volumes and volumes of reprints of Red Guard papers left from the 60s. So they produce huge amounts of materials. 256 papers in Shanghai alone in July '67 were produced by these young people for the sake of revolution, but often fighting among themselves. I said that initially it was verbal warfare, but eventually led to violence. And one of the cities where the violence was most severe was Chongqing, city of Chongqing in Sichuan province. And here is one of the few, certainly the biggest cemeteries that still remains in China today. So this picture I took in 2009 when I visited this cemetery. So in this cemetery alone were buried over 400 young people who died in this warfare. They were fighting against each other. They imagined themselves to be fighting a real revolutionary war. That was what I was told, when I was doing my research there. This is this is the inscription on this. For those of you who read Chinese, this is Mao's calligraphy. Born great, died in glory. So those who died in these factional battles were celebrated as martyrs. So there is a sense of glory to that. So that's one thing, one part of this. They also have a sense of external threat. So I mentioned early on that cyber nationalism today sometimes is a reaction against the kind of negative portrayal of China, right? But in Cold War, of course, Cold War was the Cold War. Was the kind of East-West divide was deep. So there was a sense of external threat in that Cold War context, and that threat was real. So nowadays, Cold War studies is quite in fashion. So there's one book published in 2012, Professor Nancy Tucker's book, basically shows that between U.S. and China, well, there was almost on the verge of a real nuclear war. The threat, in other words, was real. And in 1964, China's foreign minister warned the country that the Chinese were prepared for attack by the U.S. from the south, Russians from the north, Japanese from the east. So that sense of external threat was extremely powerful. And that shaped the thinking, the mentalities of the younger generation. So they were compelled to prove themselves too, like the young people today. But of course, in very radically different ways. This is the early days of the Red Guard movement. Young girls in Beijing, in the hot summer of Beijing, walking barefooted on Tiananmen Square. Imagine the streets are burning with heat. But they were emulating the revolutionary heroes of the past. But that was only the beginning. But only when we can understand this kind of practice at the beginning can we understand why later on this developed into violent warfare, fighting. So they were also compared to prove themselves. I'm going to conclude quickly so that we can have some time for questions. So my very, very kind of brief, oversimplified summary of some of the differences. So I've already talked about the similarities, right? I focused on similarities between Red Guards in the 60s and cyber nationalists today. But there are, of course, major differences, and here are some of the differences. So I said, for the Red Guards, they were dead serious. They're so serious that they were willing to die for their revolutionary cause. But for the Pink Guards, or the Pink Guard is sort of my terminology here. Is the more common nickname is Little Pink. They're not that serious. You can say they are serious today, but they'll go back to their gaming communities tomorrow. It's a different culture. There's humor and fun. The culture is more humor and fun. For the Red Guards, it was loyalty to Mao was the most important thing. loyalty to Mao, and they would pledge at the beginning of the movement, they would pledge that they were so loyal to Mao that they are willing to die for the great chairman, right? Well, the young people today still have a sense of pride of the nation, but we don't know how committed they are to that kind of commitment demonstrated by the Red Guard. Media was important in the past. Media is important today as well, except, of course, they are very different media, right? So in the past, it's print media, wall posters, pamphlets. Today, it's social media, online communities, cell phones. Red Guards lost lives. In Chongqing alone, over 1,200 people died in the middle of fighting against each other in warfare. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of death. 1,200. They really, they lost their lives. The Pink Guards, it's hard to say what they lost, right? They might have spent some time. They might have, but essentially it's the kind of keyboard participation, you might say, right? For the Red Guard generation, a lot of them later on in their memoirs, they would look back to the past and think of themselves as a lost generation. Because remember, after the Red Guard movement, which ended in 1968, the vast majority of them were sent down to the countryside to be farmers. They lost their educational opportunities. So it was a period of, they lost their youth, basically. That's what happened to the Red Guard generation. But for the Little Pink generation, of course, a lot of them are young professionals or college students or even high school students. They are still in the prime of their lives, and again, they're still young. We don't know what, they might have a bright future in front. The Red Guard movement lasted 2 years, but then the send-down movement lasted about 10 years or more. That's a long time, right? That Little Pink phenomenon, that Little Pink expedition lasted only one night. So it's episodic. We can think of this as an episodic thing. One night and then back to normal life. That's very different. Red Guard movement happened in a closed society. Chinese society was very closed. People didn't know what was happening outside the country. There was hardly any television or telephone. Not to say internet, of course, right? It was very closed society. Today is open society. Information is available easily, despite censorship, right? That makes a lot of difference when it comes to how do we make up our mind about what to do. Information is important. Now young people are informed. In China at that time, Cultural Revolution, weak economy, today strong economy. So these are some of the differences when it comes to understanding these two groups. Final slide, and I'll stop, is how to explain these differences between these two generations. And I've talked about basic, general social historical conditions. Economic, social, political, cultural, generational change are tremendous in these past 4 decades. And this certainly helped to understand why we have a new generation of Little Pink, but which has in some ways similar to Red Guards, but in many other ways are very different. And because of all these changes, they have very different moral horizons. And this is one of the key terms I actually wanted to talk about, but I see that we are running out of time. For Aristotle, a good life is a life devoted to contemplation, to political acts. Life itself, its mere existence, is not considered a good life. Imagine what was the good life for the Red Guard generation. For the Red Guard generation, a good life was to be a revolutionary hero. It was not about making money. It was not about yourself. Down with the self was one of their slogans. That was the moral horizon in which they lived. That's what they saw. That was the value, what their understanding was about the value of life, the meaning of life. But today is totally different. Some people, we do still have dreams and aspirations, but ordinary life is just as important as that kind of heroic life, good life, right? So how do we understand the meaning of political commitment? I think it has a lot to do with historical change, cultural differences, social change. The meaning of politics, of engagement, changes with time. That's because people's mental outlooks, worldviews, values also change. And I think I should stop. Thank you.
Given all the different movements, the different generations, are you more or less, I guess, optimistic about the future of China, especially the role of the internet? Because arguably the state has done the impossible so far, right? In the same time ramping up the internet, but also maintaining very rigorous control and the social stability. And we're trying to ask is should China become more democratic, or should democracies become more like China? Something like that.
Well, it's a tough question. I think one thing about China is it changes all the time. In the sense that that there is really no one China. That's partly because it changes all the time. So today's China, I think, is different from 5 years ago. So by that I mean the current president, Xi Jinping, after he became president, a lot of things have been changing a lot, meaning that there is more and more ideological control. You might say that it's less and less open in some ways. There's more and more internet censorship. But before that, in 2000 or even in 2005, because at that time I was doing a lot of research for my book, which was published in 2009, was more open than today. But it doesn't mean that, this is my personal view, it doesn't mean that what's happening today will stay the same all the time, right? Because I think it's always a process of change. There might be changes down, 3 years from now, 5 years from now. So that's one thing, that history changes, it's not static. But China is also such a huge country. Well, in terms of territory, it's fine, but China is huge in the sense that it has such regional differences. In some parts of the country, it's much more open than others. Among some population, people have more freedom to speak out than others. Even the intellectuals nowadays, as we know, there's more and more ideological control in universities. But on WeChat circles, I'm sure some of you are on WeChat circles, people are still very articulate and critical, right, among small circles of friends. Even in the Cultural Revolution period, there were differences. Some of the young people I studied who were sent down to the countryside, they had terrible material life, very poor lives. Often, didn't have enough food. But some of them talk about how free they were in rural areas to do their own things, to reading. They were reading forbidden books that were banned. But in the rural areas, nobody really cared about what they were doing. It's in the cities that have more political control. So, so that's not a straightforward response to your question.
I was just wondering, because the control is really getting tighter and tighter, and for the younger generation, I feel like they're even more conservative and on the left than we are. It's just increasingly, because many of our friends, they work in the media, they're getting more and more frustrated, and because of the current.
Yeah, I totally agree. So I spent some time in the summer, and this summer I actually took some students there with me to study Chinese media, and we spent some time with Chinese college students. Our students basically interact with Chinese college students. On one occasion, we had a discussion about internet censorship. It was a very fascinating discussion. So, the Chinese students, some of them are supportive of censorship, but others are against it. So they are, in other words, they have divided views. Those who are supportive of government censorship, they make an argument about, nowadays cyberspace is full of terrorism, fake news. Sometimes it can endanger national security. They use this kind of discourse, and they would argue that, national security is important, and they would support censorship because of national security.
Or pornography, no?
Pornography, of course, yes. So. But I agree with you. It's true. A lot of people are becoming, you might say, more conservative. But I also think that the young people, they're still not the same. They have different ideas, different views about what's happening. Some of them are more happier, than others. Some of them more critical than others.
Any student have a question? Even small, big, or whatever. Raise your hand.
Yes, please.
So does this younger generation think that being called little pink is kind of ridiculing their whatever their efforts are, or do they not be compared to the, or what do they also think about being compared to the Red Guard?
Well, of course they don't want to be compared to the Red Guards, because Red Guard has a very negative image. Even in Chinese official, China has an official verdict about the history of the Cultural Revolution. In that official verdict, the Cultural Revolution was a disaster, right? So Red Guards caused a lot of violence, which was certainly true. So these young people, they of course they don't want to be compared to the Red Guards, and they would claim that for all the reasons I mentioned, a lot of those I mentioned, they are very different. And then they would argue that it's not wrong to be patriotic, right? That kind of language. But then they also, I think I used the word episodic, because I thought, there's a different kind of loyalty. Red Guard loyalty, some people would think that Red Guard loyalty was blind loyalty. But this newer generation, it's not kind of blind loyalty. They have their own things to do, right? They are in gaming communities, they have friends. They might be, today somebody is mobilizing an expedition, political expedition, they join it, but tomorrow they go back to their other things. They have multiple things to be busy with. So in that sense, I think, again, it's a major difference from the past. Did that help? Yeah. And again, information is really important, that they are much more informed than the young people in the 60s about what's happening in China, about what's happening outside of China.
I just was, thinking about the differences. It seems, one main difference is just the bodily component. Where here, now, so much is so virtual.
Mm-hmm.
And back then, like you said, they're really putting their lives on the line. And so do you think that the Little Pinks would ever get to the point where they would put their body in the place of their minds, or
Mm-hmm.
What I mean?
Yeah. That's a great question. I don't know. We haven't, years ago, let's say 10 years ago, there are a number of cases of nationalistic protests which brought people to the street in China in several cases. It's pro-Chinese, yeah. So they were not putting their lives on the line in a way, because yeah, they had their bodies in the streets, and then they joined rallies and demonstrations protesting against Japan, for instance, anti-Japan protests. So this happened quite a few times years ago, but in recent years, it's interesting that more and more of this is just happening online in this kind of cyberspaces. But the curiously, actually, it's not making less impact. I think it's still making a lot of impact in the sense that it attracts a lot of mainstream media attention in China and outside of China. So even if it's a seemingly minor cyberspace thing, whenever it's covered by mainstream media, it becomes a major event. So in that sense, it's actually still very influential, even though it's just happening in cyberspace.
So you call little pink. We know red guards usually, of course, male or female, maybe at least half and half. But the little pink, most are younger and girls. So why these young girls become so patriotic? What's the motivation behind? Why the young girls? I just look at them.
So this is what we read from some of the media stories. There is no firm evidence. There is no firm evidence that actually there are more females than males who are involved in this.
Just call them Little Pink.
Somehow they got the name Little Pink, which is kind of very feminine, right? Kind of a nickname. But there's one of our students actually at Annenberg School has done research on this and didn't find firm evidence that actually is more females than males. It's probably a kind of just a discourse in the media.
But isn't the gaming culture in China the same way here? That it's mostly male or no?
Well, there are two kinds of cultures. Gaming mostly males, but there's also these fandom communities, like the literature city fandom community. Those communities, a lot of females, young females. So it's a very interesting question, because when you think about Red Guard movement, remember the one example I gave were young girls walking barefooted on Tiananmen Square. Young girls also in the Red Guard movement, I think in Beijing, the first death was caused by high school students, young female students in a high school in Beijing. In other words, young female students can be as radical as male students. It's hard to say which is which.
So bottom line, which one do you think is more meaningful then? I want to know how do you, sorry, I'm a super scientist. How do you operationalize the meaningful? You know what I mean? Like, what is the conclusion like?
Well, again, there is no straightforward answer to that question. I think if we recall the example I gave at the beginning, hashtag activism versus a street protest, and there's debate about this, and a lot of people argue that cyberspace and just using keyboard, that's keyboard warrior, that's not as meaningful as high risk street radicalism. There are a number of responses I have about this kind of argument. One is that high-risk activism does not happen abruptly, meaning that when you are involved in activism, you do not find yourself suddenly brave enough tomorrow to face a tank. It's a process of personal change. Initially, you may be a little bit engaged in this and that, doing a little bit of volunteer work. Gradually, you become more and more involved and more committed and dedicated. And then, only then, after a period of time, you might be able to be brave enough, let's say, to take to the street or to face the police. In other words, they are both equally meaningful. Cyber activism and street radicalism is equally meaningful, and it's one process, right? You just don't. The experience is important. That's one thing. Second response is I was saying that high life, high ideals, and ordinary life. For some people, their political ideals have changed. We no longer want to be martyrs. We no longer want to be that kind of heroes. But we still want to be engaged. So to be engaged online, to some extent, is meaningful experience for these people. Not to say that those who are involved in street activism is less meaningful. Again, I think they are equally meaningful. But then we have people who are involved in this at this point, and others who are involved in that kind of activism. There is even a division of labor, you might say, among activists, right? That some people have more time. Some people are professional activists in, let's say, nonprofits, NGOs. Others are busy students, right? But you still want to be engaged, and you try to find some ways of engaging in this kind of activism. So my sort of simplified answer is that there's no straightforward answer to that question, which is more meaningful than the other. I think they are both meaningful in different ways, and they are related. They are not it's not a dichotomy of keyboard warrior and street warrior. No, I think it's related.
Thank you.
Anything? Okay.
Thank you.